Hello and welcome to In the Spotlight with Quocirca, the definitive podcast on digital disruption in the print industry. I'm Louella Fernandes, and today I'm joined by Roger Stocker, CEO of Intuitive. We'll be discussing all things analytics and how analytics can really help manufacturers and their channel partners to drive more engagement and value from their MPS contracts. So welcome, Roger. It's great to have you here today.
Good morning.
So maybe if we could just kick off, if you could introduce yourself and your role at Intuitive. And I know Intuitive didn't start in the print world, so maybe you could give us a bit of background about the company as well.
Yes, thanks, Lola. Yes, I founded Intuitive 10 years ago. So I was one of two people who founded the company, and then I subsequently became CEO. And the vision from Intuitive came from my previous business that I owned, where I had a consultancy business and we got bigger and bigger over time. And I used to spend more and more time at month's end trying to compile spreadsheets, trying to work out what was going on in the business and thinking there must be a better way. So Intuitive was originally founded to allow operational people to self-serve management information. The company then grew. We went into the channel, and over the last 4 or 5 years, we've kind of found the sweet spot for us, which is really around print and process analytics. So trying to give our partners and our customers analytic solutions that work out the box with best practice design, best practice data models that give them something they get real value out of without spending lots and lots of time implementing it.
The journey to entering the print world, how did that come about?
So the print initiative really came out of two different things we were doing. We were working in the States, and we were doing a lot of work in the fax market because fax is still huge in the States, especially in the healthcare market. And some of the customers that we were providing fax solutions for said, actually, fax is great, but print is a far bigger problem. Could you start to look at print? And then we also had a very successful partner called Process Flows, and Process Flows were acquired by Quocirca about 4 years ago. And through Process Flows, we got introduced to Quocirca and the world of the print in a little bit more detail. And then the journey started, and we began to see that, oh boy, does the print industry create a lot of data. Yeah, and we saw the dynamics of huge amounts of data being produced, but people really not being able to interpret it because there was just too much. It wasn't in the right format. It was hard to understand, and so that's how we started on that. We started on that journey. From that early work with Quocirca, we started talking to the vendor market, and Papercut in particular really had a very similar vision to us. So we started working with Papercut and launched something into the Papercut market. And then the pandemic hit. And like everybody, we've had our challenges with the pandemic. So we've actually managed to sign distribution agreements around the world in the last 12 months without me leaving Yorkshire, which is quite incredible. It's something I never thought would be possible. And today, that's really been the growth engine. And we've really, over the last 12 months, acquired about 100 partners who are now starting to engage with our product.
Okay, well, that's brilliant that you've managed to see that growth over, what has been such a challenging year for the industry. So, so maybe if we can pick up on that point. So, clearly the pandemic has had, huge repercussions for the print industry. And Intuitive is very well positioned, I guess, to understand print usage and, what companies are printing and where their volumes are going up and down. So what are your observations on the trends that we're seeing in the industry and perhaps the challenges that manufacturers and their partners are facing?
Before COVID, we'd seen that the suppliers in this market were seeing slow declines in their print volumes and recognizing that they were going to have to come up with new solutions and new revenue streams to allow their business to evolve. So we saw many of the providers start to acquire other providers to get scale. We saw many providers start to buy ECM or ICT companies to fill out So really there was two challenges which came as part of that. First is the normal ones, that when you acquire another technology company, you've got to retain all the staff and you've got to integrate the two cultures. And it's something that is very, very hard to do in the technology industry. And you see a lot of failed acquisitions. And secondly, was that these new solutions really have different buying cycles and they have different decision makers within the client's organizations. So whereas they've got new solutions, the people that they had the relationship within those organizations weren't necessarily the people that brought them. And they had to find a way of linking the two together. And that's where print analytics comes in, because you can use your print data to understand things within your customer's business. And if you can then understand things within your customer's business, you can spot opportunities to add value to that customer by making them more efficient or by growing revenues. And that's really where we've tried to start to fit in.
Yeah, so I think that's, what we also see in a lot of the research that we do is that MPS, clearly is very mature and there's still opportunities in the industry, but most of the opportunities are around digitization, digital transformation, and like you say, some of these adjacent services, ECM, IT services, and so on. And, we really do believe there's opportunities for the channel to exploit the analytics to enable them to, I guess, drive more synergies between traditional print and some of these digitization opportunities. So have you got any examples of customers you're working with, whether they're the OEMs or the channel partners, in terms of how they're leveraging Intuitive to help them drive more value in their MPS engagements?
Yeah, there's probably a few. So what we've started to see is, and I can give a great example of a major logistics company where the supplier identified that through the print data that their whole holiday authorization process was manual. And by doing that, it wasn't about reducing the cost of the print. It was the fact that it was a manual process, and that manual process could be automated. And for me, I think of how probably printing different to a lot of people in the industry. I see printing as part of a manual business process. Yeah? So you think about digitization. Why do you print? It's because you haven't got two systems integrated. So you'll go and undertake some manual tasks. And if you start to think about print as just a manual part of a business process, you then start to say, well, why are we printing? And what could we do differently? And when you start to understand that, you can start to look about how you can add value. And another example, probably this one from a few years back, but in the insurance industry, I saw renewals being printed out and being sent to customers, and then documents would be coming back in, they'd be scanned, and then they would be processed. And actually, by digitizing that process, not only did you make it more efficient, but you made it an interactive communication with the customer, either on the web or via the telephone. And when it becomes interactive, you can start to then personalize the service to the customer. You've got an opportunity to upsell, and you get a lot more value out of that transaction. And I think that's where the print industry can really start to innovate. We've got another really good example from one of our partners, a company called EcoPrintQ in the States. And they've just integrated print data with HR data. So rather than looking at how people are printing by where they sit in an organization, they've started to analyze printing by what role somebody does. And then by understanding what role somebody does, you then get more into the business process, and you can start to see trends. Yeah, and that's where you can then start to add value.
Yeah, so I think that point you mentioned about print being part of that manual business process is really important. And, I think print has been resilient in certain vertical markets. So, just based on the data that you track, would you say that print has been resilient in certain industries? And what have you seen from your own experience in terms of your data reporting?
We track data across a wide variety of customers, countries, and sectors. So we saw that in overall terms, that when the pandemic hit in March and April of last year, we saw a sudden drop off in printing. So across all industries, print was down by about 70%. We saw that starting to really recover in September and October last year. And companies went from being 70% down to sort of 30% down. And then going into early December, we saw some industries almost completely recover. But within that, there's some huge, big differences within sectors. So if you look at the education market was 95% down and never really recovered. It managed to get up to about 80% down, but actually completely changed. And it'll be interesting that now with schools giving digitization services, whether we go back to that way of learning. But then if you look at other sectors, NHS was 20% down but remained static. Emergency services to 20% down, but then actually when the lockdown ended, they were actually printing more as they had more, I guess, more offences to deal with. And then in the private sector's shown a lot more resilience. The private sector has really been 25 to 30% down, and that's not changed. And it's not changed as the lockdowns evolved. And I think that's because a lot of private sector companies changed the way they were working, implemented that business practice, and now it's sort of wired in. But then we also saw other changes where volumes increased. So certainly I saw in some organisations peak usage increase because with some jobs, when you're in the office, you've got 3 screens that you do to use your job. You can't have 3 screens at home, especially if you've got multiple people working at home, which everybody's had to contend with. So people have been going in, printing large amounts of documents off, and then working sort of from paper, but at home and online. So we suddenly saw certain devices where the usage went up, where lots of amounts of printing were done, and then that begs the issue, does that need to be distributed out because you can't have people close together? And then in certain functions such as customer services, lots of people changed to doing transactions over the web, but the back office was not always completely automated because those changes had to happen very quickly. So what we saw was web-based transactions leading to increased printing because actually the infrastructure wasn't there, and the only way to do it was to print and go back to processing things manually. So lots of different changes, lots of different industries.
Yeah, that was some really great insight actually to see the kind of variations in different industry sectors. And, I think it leads us nicely on to the next point around the hybrid work environment, because clearly remote working is changing the way everyone is working. And, even with the return to the office, many of us will still, be working 2 or 3 days at home and, the rest in the office. And that obviously has a huge impact on print volumes in the office. So I'm interested in your thoughts. Firstly, you kind of touched on a bit, but whether print volumes will recover in certain sectors, because many of us are now used to working digitally now at home. So will that carry on in the office? And secondly, is this creating a need for offices to be able to track and manage home printing? And, does Intuitive have the capabilities to help, businesses do that?
Yeah, no, I think the change is quite interesting. So certainly from some of the research I've seen, there's a lot of people want to get back in the office. Roughly from what you see, 2/3 of people want to go back to doing some form of office working because people do get very, very isolated. And I think the change that I've seen probably over the last 3 or 4 months is the security around home printing has really risen up the agenda. So everybody enabled people to print at home. Printing starts to print at home, but then you realise actually you lose control of your documents. You don't know what's being printed. And if you're in certain industries such as social care or dealing with vulnerable people or financial services, those become quite pertinent issues. So I've seen some organisations start to turn off home printing and say, no, printing's got to come from the office because the systems that they've got are only enabled to track printing in the office. And then we've seen some of the vendors then start to build that functionality into their products. And then our role is, if it's starting to be captured by the print management system, we can start to report on it. But I think the other thing is, as you say, printing's going to change, and at the moment, nobody knows how printing's going to change, and because nobody knows, and it's changed from being static to being dynamic. That's why organisations seem to want to be able to measure it. And I think that's why we've seen the big growth in our business. And that's short term is actually we need to make sure that we're not getting hotspots within our organisation of everything being printed on one device, and we end up with breaking all of the social distances rules around the printer. And I think longer term, it's very much about actually, how's this dynamic going to change? Well, when most people come up to refresh their contracts over the next 2 or 3 years, it's not like before where it's 5% than it was last contract. It's going to change completely. And they've got to be able to see those trends, and they've got to see how those trends are changing on time, so that when they come to refresh their contracts, they can plan appropriately.
Yeah, and I think that's, absolutely. We've always seen analytics as, key to any MPS engagement, whether it's the assessment at the outset in terms of evaluating the print environment and developing an optimization around, the printer fleet, but also ongoing analytics and, ongoing remote monitoring, for security purposes. So analytics is really fundamental to every stage of the MPS engagement. And it's interesting because some MPS providers, have very sort of strong analytics capabilities and really push that forward. But I think for the channel, they don't always have the resources or the expertise to be able to do a lot of these analytics themselves. So what do you think is perhaps holding back the use of analytics amongst the channel, and how can they overcome that? And, how could Intuitive help them?
I think there's a number of different issues there. I think some of them are cultural, and that organisations need to change their mindset and think about how do we embed analytics into everything we do. And some of it is then around the data issues and how do you make these solutions easy. So dealing with them in the reverse order, analytics is one of those things that looks really, really easy. Yeah. And, you can take a tool, you can take some data, you can put it into some charts, and yes, it looks pretty, but you soon begin to understand that it doesn't have any real long-term value. It doesn't give people information that they can't get normally. So you have to offer a good analytics solution. You've got to build a lot of sophistication into the data to give people the insights that they really want to do. And that requires investment, because most organisations, whether IT is under pressure, won't want to run a big project to give them print analytics. So as an industry, it's one of the things we have to do is give high value insights, but do it in a way that can be deployed quickly. And something we learned as we went on our journey was our early print solutions used to take 2 weeks to deploy, and there was a level of uptake. Now we get those deployed in about 2 hours, and because it's easy, we've seen a massive uptake in demand. So you've got to have valuable insight, and you've got to make it You've got to make it easy. And then from a cultural and organisation side, companies need to think about how they're going to do things differently. So I go back, when I started my career, I worked for a company called ICL, and we sold mainframes. And we knew the future was software and services, but we made too much money out of mainframes. And in the meantime, lots and lots of small, smart companies started forming that could innovate. They could innovate faster, and from that, they came up with really, really good solutions, and they went on to be great companies. And I think for the print industry, sometimes they've almost got to break the way they're thinking, and completely change the way they're doing, because if they don't, they won't get into the new world. They won't get into the new world fast enough. So I think you've got to do it. And it's interesting. If I look at some of our most successful partners, they've now started to include what we do in every single one of their sales. So if I look at our most successful partners, Intuitive is not sold something separate. It's embedded into the core proposition. So that's either a new business opportunity or a contract renewal. And depending on the market and depending on the provider, we're seeing that somewhere between high 30s and mid 60s of those deals now have Intuitive included in them. So that's great for the partners, because that means there's some additional revenue coming in when the volumes are down. So it gives them a way to quickly get some additional revenue by delivering value to customers. And then the really clever guys have then started to take that data and not just sell it to the customer. What they've then started to do is then sell their own time and their own services to analyze that data in more depth, and then present back to the customer where the opportunities are. And once they then present back to the opportunities, they're the first company who can influence the customer in terms of, why don't we do this strategy, because it's going to help your business become more efficient or grow. And I think that's the journey that we're beginning to see starting to accelerate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the print industry is, it's very much a legacy traditional industry, and the past year has shown that it really needed to adapt a lot quicker, and some were doing better than others, like you say, and every industry player now has to kind of rethink and reinvent their businesses. And I think you've given a really good insight into how analytics can actually help them on that journey, because it helps them move up the value chain from traditional commodity sales, I guess, around the hardware and the box, and moving up to that sort of software and services capability, and getting better insight and being able to deliver better business outcomes for their customers. So on a final note, really just around where you see the trends, do you have any sort of thoughts on cloud? We touched on obviously security, but how is Intuitive addressing the bigger need for the cloud now that's really accelerated over the past year?
Well, I think cloud is a massive opportunity, because at the moment most print solutions are sold on premise, and while we provide visualization, the visualization then will sit on premise with the solution. So as the print solutions move into cloud, you can start to bring the data into the cloud. And that then starts to allow our partners to provide more valuable information, because you can start to do cross-company analysis. So you can start to tell your customers, actually, your business looks like that, but actually you're ahead of the rest of your peers, or you're behind the rest of the peers. And so suddenly, by bringing all of that data together, and it happening naturally, I think the providers in this market will be able to do some real value add analysis for their customers, and I think that will start to really move them forward. And then as things start to move into the cloud, you can start to take advantage of other services. So there's things like there's lots of content analytics in the cloud at the moment. So you can start to, again, take advantages of these services on the fly. So take your print stream on the fly, start to analyze what type of document it is, feed that back into the analytics, and then suddenly you're then able to give far more powerful information to the customer. And then I think the last element on that is you're beginning to see lots more rich data sets which you can integrate with your print data. So earlier I talked about Eco Print Queue and HR data. And again, I see enriching that data with other data sources so that you can provide much more in-context information about what's going on to a customer's business will again be another form of innovation.
And actually, I guess a really good opportunity there is around sustainability and being able to show a business what their environmental impact is, not just with print, but other parts of the business. And I guess your relationship with EcoPrint is, one step towards, providing businesses with that broader picture. So, I think sustainability is definitely becoming, more of a priority.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. It's one that just over the last 2 months, the whole environmental impact has started to really come back up the agenda again, and organisations becoming again more aware of it. So all of a sudden we've had lots of demands to provide more complex analytics around that environmental element. And again, at the moment that's intercompany, but I think that's a great example, Louella, of where cross-company analytics could really drive this initiative forward, which will be brilliant.
Yeah, so I think we've touched on so many topics. We could probably talk for a lot longer on analytics. It's such a big topic, but I think we've really gain some insight into, how analytics can really help manufacturers and their partners get a better understanding of what their customers are doing and potentially then, drive higher value MPS-led engagements around digital transformation. So I just wanted to really end on a bit of more lighthearted note. Clearly we're sort of gradually moving out of lockdown, and I was just curious as to whether you've got any plans to go anywhere in particular once it's safe to travel again.
Well, you can see from the shirt behind me, I'm a massive rugby fan. So I was due to be going on the British Lions tour later this year. So we're waiting to see whether that happens. And if that goes ahead, absolutely, I'll be going out to South Africa. But I'm quite lucky. Over the last 12 months, I've signed partners in Australia, Florida, South Africa, Italy. So I've got a bit of a world tour coming up because I've got all of these new partners, and actually I've never met any of them in person yet. So I'm looking forward to some quite extensive travel plans going for the rest of 21 and into 22.
Yeah, brilliant. I think, like you say, it's amazing that we've been able to carry on our businesses, over the pandemic without actually traveling, but at the same time, nothing replaces that kind of face-to-face contact. So, hopefully it won't be long before you can meet all your new clients. So, but thank you again, Roger. That's been, really interesting, and I hope that the audience really understands, the value of analytics. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure. And, if anybody wants more information, there's lots of case studies on our website at weareintuitive.com. So come in, have a look. And if there's something you want to help there, please reach out to us.
So thank you very much for joining in the Spotlight with Quocirca. I really appreciate you taking the time to join this podcast episode. For more information, please go to quocirca.com. We've got a dedicated landing page for all our podcasts, and you can sign up to our newsletter to be notified when we release a new podcast episode. So thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you on our next podcast episode.